On the 4th of November, 1922, a boy carrying water across the sand in the Valley of the Kings stumbled over a stone. The stone was not merely a rock. It was the top of a step, the first of 16 steps that led downward into the earth, through the rubble and the debris of more than 3,000 years, to a sealed doorway bearing the cartouche of a pharaoh whose name had been deliberately erased from the official records of the Egyptian state. A pharaoh so thoroughly, so systematically, and so comprehensively removed from the official historical record of the Egyptian state that no one in the modern world, no scholar, no archaeologist, no historian, knew he had existed until a persistent British archaeologist named Howard Carter spent 5 years digging through the empty and picked-over Valley of the Kings on the increasingly skeptical dollar of an English aristocrat named George Herp, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, who had been ready to pull his funding and walk away when a water boy tripped over a stone and changed the history of archaeology forever. 22 days later, on the 26th of November, 1922, Howard Carter stood before a sealed doorway at the bottom of a corridor, held a candle up to a small hole he had made in the upper left corner of the blocked entrance, and peered into the darkness of a room that had not been seen by a living human being in more than 3,200 years. The candle flame wavered, hot air from the sealed chamber flowing through the hole, and then steadied, and in the golden light Carter saw shapes, gold shapes, animal shapes, the gleam of metal, the curve of a carved head, the glint of inlaid eyes staring back at him from across 32 centuries of silence and darkness and geological protection. Lord Carnarvon, standing behind Carter, unable to see past the archaeologist's head, asked the question that would become the most famous line in the history of modern archaeology. "Can you see anything?" Carter, his eyes adjusting to the candlelight, his voice barely steady, replied with 2 words that would echo through the next century of popular culture, museum exhibitions, film, and literature. Yes, wonderful things. The wonderful things that Carter saw through that small hole in the blocked doorway constituted what lay behind that sealed, plaster-covered, hieroglyphic-stamped doorway was the most complete, the most lavishly equipped, and the most archaeologically significant royal burial ever discovered in the history of Egyptian archaeology. More than 5,000 artifacts, packed into 4 small rooms that had remained sealed and essentially undisturbed for approximately 3,250 years. Gold. Everywhere, gold shrines, gold coffins, gold statues, gold jewelry, gold chariots, gold daggers, gold sandals, gold finger covers, gold toe covers, and a solid gold inner coffin weighing approximately 110 kilograms that contained the mummified body of a young man who had died at approximately the age of 19 after ruling Egypt for roughly a decade. Over the face of the mummy lay a death mask made of 11 kilograms of solid gold, inlaid with lapis lazuli, carnelian, obsidian, turquoise, and coloured glass. A mask of such extraordinary beauty, such technical perfection, and such haunting, almost otherworldly composure that it has become the single most recognised, most widely reproduced, most commercially exploited, most culturally iconic, and most emotionally resonant artifact from the entire ancient world, and the most famous image in the entire history of human civilization. More widely recognized than the Mona Lisa, more instantly identifiable than the Venus de Milo, more familiar than any classical sculpture, more universally known than any other single artifact from any period of human history. The mask weighs approximately 11 kilograms. 11 kilograms of solid gold, shaped and beaten and polished by craftsmen whose names are lost but whose skill has never been surpassed, inlaid with materials that were sourced from across the ancient world. Lapis lazuli from the mountains of Afghanistan, carnelian from the deserts of the eastern Sahara, obsidian from volcanic deposits, turquoise from the mines of the Sinai Peninsula. The face on the mask stares forward with the calm, unblinking certainty of a god. But the body beneath the mask was not the body of a god. It was the body of a teenager. A boy who had inherited the throne at the age of 9, who had ruled through a period of catastrophic theological and political transition, whose body showed evidence of malaria, a clubfoot, and a bone disorder probably caused by the inbreeding that had characterized his family for generations, and who had died from causes that have been debated by scholars, contested by medical professionals, and speculated about by the general public for more than a century, with theories ranging from murder to malaria to a broken leg to a chariot accident. Before he had reached the age of 20, the boy who lies beneath the golden mask was not a mighty pharaoh. He was a teenager, a frail, sickly, genetically compromised child who had been placed on the throne of the most powerful state in the ancient world because his father's revolution had left no other option, who had spent his brief reign surrounded by advisors who governed in his name, and who had died before the restoration he nominally led could be completed. The boy's name was Tutankhamun, and he is, by an enormous margin, the most famous pharaoh in the entire 3,000-year history of ancient Egypt, and the most famous, the most culturally ubiquitous, and the most commercially profitable ruler of the entire ancient world, not because of what he personally accomplished or conspicuously failed to accomplish during his brief, troubled, politically dependent, and largely unremarkable reign, but because of what was found in his tomb. The discovery of that tomb, on a hot, dusty November morning in 1922, in a valley that most archaeologists had written off as exhausted, was the most sensational, the most widely publicized, the most commercially exploited, and the most culturally consequential archaeological find of the 20th century. An event that triggered an unprecedented worldwide media frenzy, that launched the modern era of Egyptomania, that inspired a century of popular culture from Hollywood films to museum blockbusters, and that gave rise to the most famous, the most enduring, the most widely repeated, and the most commercially successful supernatural legend in the entire history of archaeological exploration: the Curse of the Pharaohs. When the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, the man who had financed the excavation, who had stood beside Carter at the moment of discovery, who had been among the first to enter the tomb and gaze upon the treasures within, died suddenly of blood poisoning, less than 5 months after the tomb was opened, the press erupted. The curse was real. The pharaoh was taking his revenge. The dead were punishing the living for disturbing their rest. The death of Carnarvon triggered a media phenomenon that would prove more durable and more culturally influential than the archaeological discovery itself. The story of the curse spread through the newspapers of the world with the speed and the inevitability of a contagion, fed by the sensationalist press, amplified by the pronouncements of famous figures like the novelist Marie Corelli and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, who suggested that ancient Egyptian priests had placed magical protections on the tomb that remained effective across the millennia. Every subsequent death, illness, or misfortune that befell anyone connected to the excavation, however tenuously, however distantly, was attributed to the curse, creating a narrative of supernatural vengeance that has endured for more than a century. And that continues to be the first thing most people think of when they hear the name Tutankhamun. The persistence of the curse narrative, despite its lack of any factual foundation, despite the statistical evidence that decisively refutes it, despite the clear identification of Carnarvon's death as the result of an infected mosquito bite rather than supernatural intervention, is itself a historical phenomenon of considerable interest. The curse endures because it satisfies a deep human need, the need to believe that the dead have power over the living, that sacred spaces cannot be violated with impunity, and that the treasures of the past carry with them a price that the present must pay. The curse is, in this sense, a modern myth, a story that we tell ourselves about the relationship between the living and the dead that reveals, with uncomfortable clarity, our own deepest anxieties about mortality, about the violation of sacred boundaries, and about the consequences of disturbing things that were meant to remain undisturbed. The curse was not real. The pharaoh was not taking revenge. The dead were not punishing anyone. But the story of Tutankhamun's tomb, the real story, the complete story, the archaeologically documented and historically verified story, not the Hollywood version, not the newspaper version, not the simplified, sensationalized version that has been told and retold for a century. is far more remarkable, far more haunting, and far more historically significant than any curse could ever be. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand who Tutankhamun was. Not just the golden mask, not just the curse, not just the treasures, but the boy behind the gold, the broken body behind the mask, the brief and troubled reign behind the enduring legend, and the civilization that produced a teenager who was given the seemingly impossible and historically unprecedented task of repairing the enormous institutional, economic, and theological damage that his father's radical religious revolution had inflicted on the most powerful state in the ancient world. You are going to understand how the tomb was found, what was inside it, what it tells us about the specific pharaoh whose fragile mummy lay within the magnificently crafted, nested coffins, the broken, malaria-ridden, genetically compromised body of a boy who had been asked to repair the damage of a revolution he did not cause and could not understand, and who had died before the repair was complete, and what it tells us about the civilization that buried him with such extraordinary care and such lavish wealth. And you are going to understand why the most famous pharaoh in the world, the most recognized face from the ancient world, the name that every schoolchild knows, the golden image that defines an entire civilization in the popular imagination, is famous not for what he accomplished in life, but for what was done to him in death, and why the real curse of Tutankhamun's tomb is not supernatural vengeance, but the far more disturbing curse of historical accident, in which the most famous face in ancient history belongs to a boy whose name was almost erased from time. The story of Tutankhamun is the story of the most extraordinary inversion in the history of human memory. The story of how the least important pharaoh of the most important dynasty became, through the accident of his tomb's survival and the drama of its discovery, the most famous, the most recognized, and the most culturally ubiquitous individual from the entire 3,000-year history of ancient Egypt. It is the story of a boy who was born sick, who ruled briefly, who died young, and who was buried with such extraordinary care and such lavish wealth that his tomb, a small, hastily prepared, and relatively modest burial by the standards of the pharaonic tradition, became the most famous archaeological site in the world, and the source of the most famous legend in the history of archaeology. The story of Tutankhamun is also a story about what survives and what is lost, about the role that accident, chance, and the mechanical indifference of geology play in determining which individuals are remembered and which are forgotten. The great pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, the military conquerors, the master diplomats, the theological innovators who built empires and transformed civilizations, are virtually unknown to the general public because their tombs were looted and their treasures were stolen. The boy king who inherited a broken kingdom, who could not walk without a stick, who died at 19, and who was buried in one of the smallest tombs in the Valley of the Kings, is the most famous ruler of the ancient world, a global cultural phenomenon, a household name, an icon. The irony is total, and it is one of the most important lessons that the study of the past can teach us about the profound fragility, the deep contingency, and the fundamental arbitrariness of historical memory. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let us begin the story of the boy behind the golden mask. The boy who would become Tutankhamun was born into chaos, into the wreckage of the most radical religious revolution the ancient world had ever seen, into the ruins of a theological experiment that had torn apart the most stable civilization on Earth, and into a royal family whose genetic legacy of inbreeding had left him with physical disabilities that would shape his life and hasten his death. His father, almost certainly, based on the comprehensive and groundbreaking DNA evidence published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2010, was Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who had closed the temples of the traditional gods, erased the name of Amun from every monument in Egypt, moved the capital to a new city in the desert called Akhenaten, and imposed the worship of a single deity, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, on a population that had practiced polytheism for more than 3,000 years. His mother, again based on DNA evidence, was not Nefertiti, as popular imagination has often assumed, but a woman identified in the genetic analysis only as the younger lady, a mummy found in the tomb known as KV35, who was determined to be a full sister of Akhenaten. The boy who would become Tutankhamun was the product of a brother-sister marriage, an incestuous union that was not uncommon in the Egyptian royal family, but that carried significant genetic risks that are visible in the boy's skeleton, and that may have contributed to his early death. The child was born with the name Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, a name that placed him firmly within the theological framework of his father's revolution. He was born in the city of Akhenaten, the revolutionary capital that his father had built in the empty desert, as a physical monument to the worship of the Aten, and as a deliberate rejection of everything that Thebes, the traditional religious capital, and the god Amun, the traditional supreme deity, represented. The child was born, as far as the evidence allows us to determine, sometime around 1341 BC, during the final years of his father's reign, into a royal family that was, by any standard, the most dysfunctional in the history of the 18th dynasty. His father, Akhenaten, had spent the previous decade tearing apart the theological and institutional foundations of the Egyptian state, closing the temples of the traditional gods, erasing the name of Amun from every monument in the empire, disbanding the priesthood, redirecting the temple revenues to the cult of the Aten, and neglecting the diplomatic relationships that sustained the Egyptian empire in the Levant and in Nubia. His mother, the woman whose mummy was identified in the DNA study as the younger lady, was his father's own sister, a union that was theologically sanctioned by the royal ideology, but that carried genetic consequences that would manifest in the boy's body in the form of the deformities and the diseases that would define his short life. The Queen Nefertiti, Akhenaten's chief wife, the woman whose painted limestone bust has become the most famous portrait in the history of ancient art, had disappeared from the historical record around the 12th year of the reign, her fate unknown, her relationship to the succession uncertain, and her possible role in the events that followed Akhenaten's death, the subject of an enormous and unresolved scholarly debate. The boy grew up in a city that had been built in approximately 3 years, that had been occupied for approximately 15 years, and that would be abandoned within a few years of his father's death. A city whose temples were open to the sky, whose art depicted the royal family in unprecedented scenes of domestic intimacy, and whose cemetery contained the bones of workers who had died from malnutrition, overwork, and the physical toll of building a theological utopia in the desert. When Akhenaten died, in approximately 1336 BC, after approximately 17 years on the throne, the revolution died with him. The boy who inherited the throne was approximately 9 years old. He was a child, too young to govern, too young to make policy, too young to understand the theological and political complexities of the crisis he was surrounded by advisors, men like I, the elderly courtier who may have been the boy's grandfather, and who would eventually succeed him on the throne, and Horemheb, the military commander who would succeed Aya, and who would ultimately complete the erasure of the Amarna period from the historical record. The political dynamics of the early reign are complex, and in many ways opaque. The sources are fragmentary, the chronology is confused, and the motivations of the key actors are the subject of scholarly speculation rather than documentary certainty. What is clear is that the boy king was surrounded by men who were older, more experienced, and more politically sophisticated than he was. Men who had their own agendas, their own ambitions, and their own understanding of what the restoration of the traditional order required. I, who bore the title God's Father, and who would eventually succeed Tutankhamun on the throne, may have been the grandfather of the boy, king through the maternal line, and his long career at the Egyptian court had given him an intimate knowledge of the political landscape and a network of relationships that made him one of the most powerful figures in the state. Horemheb, the military commander who would succeed I and who would found what is sometimes considered a new dynasty, was a professional soldier whose practical competence and political ambition would eventually carry him to the throne. These men, the politicians, the administrators, the military commanders who had survived the revolution and who understood the damage it had caused, would guide the boy king through the most important decision of his reign, the reversal of his father's revolution and the restoration of the traditional gods. The reversal was swift, remarkably swift, given the magnitude of the changes it involved, comprehensive in its scope and permanent in its effects. The boy changed his name from Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, a change that was not merely nominal but theological, a public declaration that the heretic pharaoh's son had rejected his father's god and returned to the god whose worship had sustained the Egyptian state for centuries. The name change was the most visible symbol of the restoration, but it was far from the most significant. The temples of Amun, which Akhenaten had closed, were reopened. The priesthood, which Akhenaten had disbanded, was reconstituted. The cult statues of the traditional gods which Akhenaten had removed or destroyed were replaced with new images of gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and every precious stone, according to the text of the Restoration Stele that the boy king erected at the temple of Karnak. The festivals that Akhenaten had cancelled were revived. The capital was moved back from Akhenaten to Thebes and Memphis. The city that Akhenaten had built was abandoned, left to the desert, left to the sand, left to the 3,000 years of silence that would follow. The Restoration Stele, discovered by the French archaeologist Georges Legrain at Karnak in 1905, 17 years before the discovery of the tomb, is one of the most important, the most theologically revealing, the most politically significant, and the most historically consequential surviving documents of the entire confused and turbulent transitional period, and one of the most eloquent, the most theologically revealing, and the most politically significant expressions of the Egyptian establishment's official response to the Amarna Revolution. The stela describes an Egypt in crisis, a land where the temples have fallen into ruin, where the gods have turned their backs on the country, where prayers go unanswered and military expeditions fail. The language is theological. It presents the Amarna Revolution not as a political event, but as a cosmic catastrophe, a violation of Ma'at, the fundamental order of the universe, that has brought divine punishment upon the land. The stela then describes the restoration, the reopening of the temples, the refunding of the priesthoods, the revival of the festivals, the return to the traditional order, with a tone of relief and gratitude that suggests the depth of the crisis that the revolution had created and the urgency and the comprehensiveness of the restoration that followed. The text of the Restoration Stele is worth examining in some detail because it provides the most eloquent and the most historically revealing surviving testimony of the Egyptian establishment's response to the crisis that the Amarna Revolution had created. The stela describes the condition of the temples, fallen into ruin, their courts overgrown with weeds, their sanctuaries used as roads, their cult statues neglected, and their offerings suspended. The stela describes the condition of the military. Expeditions that had been sent out had failed. Prayers to the gods for military success had gone unanswered, as if the gods had turned their backs on the land. The stela describes the condition of the people, a nation in spiritual and material distress, a civilization that had been shaken to its foundations by the heretic pharaoh's revolution, and that needed, urgently and comprehensively, to be restored to the path of Ma'at, the cosmic order that Akhenaten had disrupted, and that Tutankhamun's advisors were determined to restore. The restoration that Tutankhamun's Restoration Stele describes was not merely a reversal of the Amarna Revolution, it was a comprehensive rebuilding of the institutional infrastructure of the Egyptian state. New cult statues were commissioned, images of the gods in gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and every precious stone, more magnificent than the ones that Akhenaten's agents had removed or destroyed. The priesthoods were reconstituted, their members restored to their offices, their revenues refunded, their institutional structures rebuilt. The festivals that Akhenaten had cancelled were revived, their processions resumed, their music renewed, their offerings restored. The temple estates that had been confiscated and redirected to the cult of the Aten were returned to the traditional gods. the administrative capital was moved back from the isolated and theologically contaminated city of Akhenaten to the traditional, historically legitimized centers of Egyptian political and religious power. To Thebes, the sacred city of Amun, where the great temples of Karnak and Luxor stood, and to Memphis, the administrative capital where the machinery of the Egyptian state had been managed for centuries, and the city that Akhenaten had built in the desert was left to crumble and to be covered by the sand, left to the same silence and the same oblivion that would eventually consume the memory of the heretic pharaoh who built it. The abandonment of Akhenaten was not merely a political decision, it was a theological declaration, a statement that the city's very existence was an offense against the restored order, and that the only proper response to the heretics' revolution was the complete, total, and permanent erasure of everything associated with it. The boy king who presided over this restoration, who lent his name and his authority to the most comprehensive theological reversal in the history of the Egyptian state, was, by all available evidence, too young and too physically compromised to have been the driving force behind the policies that his name endorsed. The Restoration Stele speaks in the first person. I found the temples fallen into ruin, but the voice is almost certainly not the voice of a 9-year-old boy. It is the voice of the advisors, the administrators, the experienced politicians who understood the damage that the revolution had caused, and who used the boy king's authority to legitimize the restoration that they considered urgent, necessary, and theologically imperative. Tutankhamun was the name on the document, the hands that wrote it, the minds that conceived it, and the political judgment that shaped it belonged to other men, to Horemheb, to the anonymous administrators and officials whose names do not appear on the stela, but whose influence is visible in every line of the text and in every element of the policies that it describes. The aftermath of Tutankhamun's death provides further evidence of the political maneuvering that characterized the late 18th dynasty and of the vulnerability of a boy king whose death left no heir and no clear successor. A remarkable letter, known to scholars as the Zananza affair, has been found in the Hittite archives and provides a tantalizing and controversial glimpse of the desperation that followed Tutankhamun's death. The letter, written by an Egyptian queen, identified by many scholars as Akhenaten, Tutankhamun's widow, was addressed to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I, requesting that he send one of his sons to Egypt to marry her and become pharaoh. The letter is extraordinary, a request from the Egyptian royal family to a foreign power for a husband and a king, an act that was completely unprecedented in the history of Egyptian diplomacy, and that reveals the depth of the political crisis that Tutankhamun's death had created. The Hittite king, initially suspicious, eventually sent his son Zananza to Egypt, but the prince was murdered before he arrived at the court, probably by agents acting on behalf of the men who intended to seize the throne for themselves. The fate of Akhenaten herself, the young queen who had written this extraordinary letter, is unknown. She may have been compelled to marry the elderly courtier who succeeded Tutankhamun on the throne. A ring bearing the cartouches of both and Akhenaten has been found, suggesting a marriage alliance that would have provided with the dynastic legitimacy he needed to justify his claim to the throne. After this point, Akhenaten disappears from the historical record. Her fate, like so much about the end of the 18th dynasty, is lost to the silence that the pharaoh's successors imposed on the entire Amarna period and its aftermath. The Zananza affair is one of the most dramatic and most mysterious episodes in the diplomatic history of the ancient Near East, and it provides a vivid illustration of the chaos that followed the death of the boy king and the political ruthlessness, the diplomatic calculation, and the dynastic ambition of the men who eventually and successfully maneuvered themselves into position to succeed him on the throne. The physical condition of the boy king has been the subject of extensive scientific investigation, and the results paint a picture of a young man whose body was profoundly compromised by the genetic legacy of his family. A 2010 study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, led by Zahi Hawass, the Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, conducted DNA analysis and CT scanning on the mummy of Tutankhamun and on several other royal mummies from the 18th dynasty. The results were striking. The study confirmed that Tutankhamun's parents were full siblings, a finding that explains several of the physical abnormalities visible in the boy's skeleton. The study was the first time the Egyptian government had allowed genetic analysis to be performed on royal mummies, a decision that marked a new era in the scientific study of ancient Egypt, and that produced results of extraordinary significance for the understanding of the 18th dynasty's royal family and the genetic consequences of its marriage practices. The mummy showed evidence of a clubfoot, a congenital deformity of the left foot that would have made walking difficult and painful. The mummy showed evidence of choler disease, a rare bone disorder affecting the foot in the right foot. The mummy showed evidence of a vascular bone necrosis, a condition in which bone tissue dies due to reduced blood supply, in additional bones of the feet. The mummy showed traces of multiple strains of the malaria parasite Plasmodium falciparum, the most deadly form of malaria, suggesting that the boy king had suffered from chronic malaria infections throughout his short life. More than 130 walking sticks were found in his tomb, a detail that had initially seemed ceremonial, but that, in light of the skeletal evidence, took on a new and more poignant significance. The boy king had needed them. He could not walk, could not cross a palace room, could not climb a flight of stairs, could not stand comfortably for the duration of a court ceremony, could not participate in the military exercises or the hunting expeditions that the pharaonic tradition expected, without the constant, daily, hour-by-hour assistance of his walking sticks and the attendants who helped him navigate the physical world. The chariots found in the tomb, the weapons, the hunting scenes depicted on the walls. These were the trappings of a pharaoh's expected role as a warrior and a hunter. The body inside the tomb was that of a boy who could barely walk across a room without assistance. A boy whose daily life was defined not by the military campaigns and the hunting expeditions that the Egyptian artistic tradition depicted, but by the chronic pain, the limited mobility, and the physical vulnerability of a body that had been compromised by genetics before it was compromised by disease. The walking sticks themselves, more than 130 of them, of varying sizes, materials, and degrees of elaboration, constitute one of the most extensive collections of assistive mobility devices from the ancient world. Some are plain, functional objects designed for daily use, with wear marks on the handles that suggest repeated, regular use by a person who depended on them for basic locomotion. Others are elaborately decorated, carved, painted, gilded, and inlaid with precious materials, appropriate for ceremonial occasions when the pharaoh's mobility aids needed to reflect the dignity and the divine status of the person who used them. The range of sizes suggests that some of the walking sticks were made for the boy king when he was young, perhaps as young as 9 or 10, the age at which he ascended the throne, and that others were made as he grew, tracking the development of a body that was never healthy and that required continuous, lifelong mechanical assistance. The image of the boy king, leaning heavily on his walking sticks, shuffling painfully across the palace floors, carried on a litter when the distances were too great for his damaged feet to bear, an image that the skeletal evidence, the pathological findings, and the sheer number of mobility aids in the tomb compels us to accept, is one of the most poignant, the most heartbreaking, the most humanizing, and the most emotionally affecting pictures in the entire history of Egyptology. The golden mask shows a god, the skeleton shows a boy, the mask shows serenity and power, the skeleton shows pain and fragility. The gap between the mask and the skeleton, between the divine image that the civilization projected and the human reality that the body reveals, is one of the most instructive contradictions in the study of the ancient world, a contradiction that tells us as much about the nature of pharaonic ideology as it does about the life and death of the specific individual who wore the mask and walked with the sticks. The genetic analysis also revealed information about the royal family tree that was, in some cases, surprising and in other cases, deeply disturbing. The study identified the mummy previously known as KV35 Elder Lady as Queen Ti, the mother of Akhenaten, the grandmother of Tutankhamun, the commoner who had been elevated to the position of great royal wife by Amenhotep III and who had wielded an extraordinary degree of political influence throughout her husband's reign and into the reign of her son. The identification of Tai was itself a significant achievement, a confirmation of a hypothesis that Egyptologists had debated for decades and that the genetic evidence now placed beyond reasonable doubt. The study also identified the mummy known as KV-35 Younger Lady as both the mother of Tutankhamun and a full sister of Akhenaten, a finding that confirmed the incestuous nature of the boy king's parentage and that explained the genetic disorders visible in his skeleton. The consequences of the inbreeding were not merely cosmetic or orthopedic, they were systemic, affecting the boy's immune system, his bone development, and his overall physical resilience in ways that made him vulnerable to the infections and the complications that would eventually kill him. The combination of a congenital clubfoot, a degenerative bone disease, chronic malaria, and the compromised immune function associated with inbreeding created a medical profile of extraordinary fragility. A body that was, from the moment of its conception, engaged in a constant, exhausting, and ultimately losing battle against the biological consequences of its own genetic inheritance. The cause of Tutankhamun's death remains one of the most debated questions in Egyptology, a question that has generated an enormous volume of scholarship, speculation, and popular fascination. The malaria infections, combined with the bone disorder and the congenital foot deformities, would have left the boy king in a state of chronic physical vulnerability. A young man whose immune system was compromised, whose mobility was limited, and whose body was ill-equipped to withstand the additional stresses that illness, injury, or infection might impose. The CT scans revealed a fracture in the left leg, a break that had occurred shortly before death and that had not had time to heal. Some scholars have suggested that the fracture was the precipitating event, that Tutankhamun fell, broke his leg, contracted an infection in the broken bone, and died of septicemia compounded by the chronic malaria infections that had already weakened his system. Others have suggested that the fracture occurred after death, that it was caused by the mummification process or by the handling of the mummy in modern times. The question remains unresolved, and it may never be definitively resolved because the surviving evidence is maddeningly ambiguous and the competing interpretations are equally plausible. The reign of Tutankhamun presents one of the most fascinating paradoxes in the history of ancient Egypt, a paradox that the golden mask and the treasure-filled tomb have, for a century, obscured rather than illuminated. The paradox is this: the most famous pharaoh in the history of Egypt was, by the standards of his own civilization, one of the least significant. His reign lasted approximately 10 years, a brief span by the standards of the 18th dynasty, which had produced pharaohs who ruled for decades. His personal military accomplishments were, by all available evidence, modest at best. A few campaigns in Nubia and the Levant, managed by his generals rather than by the pharaoh himself. His personal building program was severely limited, constrained by the resources that had been depleted by his father's revolution and by the urgent need to redirect those resources toward the restoration of the traditional temples. His personal achievements are virtually unknown. The historical record of his reign is thin, fragmentary, and overwhelmingly dominated by the restoration of the traditional religion, a project that was driven not by the boy king himself, but by the advisors who governed in his name. And yet this unremarkable pharaoh, this child king who was placed on the throne as a puppet, who governed through advisors, who died before he reached the age of 20, and whose name was deliberately erased from the official records by his successors, became, through the accident of his tomb survival, the drama and the romance of its spectacular discovery, the most famous, the most widely recognized, and the most culturally ubiquitous ruler of the entire ancient world. The paradox is instructive, and it raises questions about the relationship between historical significance and historical fame, between what a person accomplished in life and how they are remembered in death, that extend far beyond the specific case of Tutankhamun and into the most fundamental questions about how civilizations construct their pasts, how they choose their heroes, and how they assign significance to the individuals whose names they preserve and whose faces they remember, and into the general problem of how civilizations remember and forget their rulers, their achievements, and their failures. The tomb itself, designated KV62 in the modern numbering system of the Valley of the Kings, is remarkably small for a royal burial. It consists of only 4 rooms: the antechamber, the annex, the burial chamber, and the treasury, compared to the vast, multi-corridored tombs that the great pharaohs of the 18th dynasty had carved into the cliffs of the valley. The small size of the tomb has led some scholars to suggest that it was not originally intended for a pharaoh, that it may have been a nobleman's tomb hastily adapted for the royal burial when Tutankhamun died unexpectedly and before a larger, more appropriately royal tomb could be completed. Other scholars have suggested that the small tomb was the result of the political circumstances of Tutankhamun's burial, that the men who buried him were already looking beyond his reign to their own succession, and that they were unwilling to invest the time and resources that a larger tomb would have required. But here is the problem, and it is a problem that makes the tomb of Tutankhamun one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. Important not merely for the beauty and the value of the objects it contained, but for the completeness and the coherence of the information it provides about the Egyptian funerary tradition, the Egyptian belief in the afterlife, and the extraordinary resources that the Egyptian state was willing to devote to the care of its dead kings. The significance of the tomb's survival extends far beyond the specific case of Tutankhamun. Before the discovery of KV62, the Egyptian funerary tradition, the most elaborate and the most materially intensive system of death ritual in the history of human civilization, was known primarily through tomb paintings, funerary texts, and the fragmentary remains of burial equipment that had survived the depredations of 3 millennia of tomb robbery. The discovery of an intact tomb, with its contents in place, its coffins nested, its shrines assembled, its mummy undisturbed, provided for the first time a complete, coherent, three-dimensional, and archaeologically unprecedented picture of how the magnificent, elaborate, and materially extravagant Egyptian funerary tradition actually worked in practice, how the objects were arranged, how the coffins were nested, how the shrines were assembled, and how the entire elaborate ritual apparatus functioned as an integrated theological system. Every single object in the tomb, from the grandest golden shrine to the smallest faience amulet, from the heavy stone sarcophagus to the lightest linen wrapping, had a specific, carefully defined, and theologically essential purpose, a specific role in the intricate ritual drama of death, transformation, and divine resurrection that the Egyptians believed would transform the dead pharaoh from a mortal man into an eternal god. The 4 nested shrines that enclosed the sarcophagus represented the layers of protection that separated the dead king from the world of the living. The 3 nested coffins that enclosed the mummy represented the multiple bodies, the physical, the spiritual, the divine, that the Egyptians believed the dead possessed. The golden mask that covered the mummy's face was not a portrait, it was a divine face. The face that the pharaoh would wear forever in the afterlife, the face that would identify him to the gods, the eternal, unchanging, divinely perfected face that would identify the dead king to the gods, and that would allow his ka, his life force, to recognize its own body and return to it after the journey through the underworld. The tomb is, in this sense, a theological document, a physical text that describes, in the language of objects rather than the language of words, the Egyptian understanding of death, resurrection, and eternal life. And it is the only such document that survives in anything approaching completeness. The only case in which we can see the entire system of Egyptian funerary practice as it was actually implemented, rather than as it was described in the texts or depicted on the walls of tombs that were subsequently stripped of their contents and left as empty architectural shells. The 4 rooms of the tomb, antechamber, annex, burial chamber, and treasury, correspond to specific stages in the Egyptian funerary ritual and contain specific categories of objects designed to serve specific theological purposes. The antechamber contained the objects that the dead king would need for daily life in the afterlife: furniture, clothing, food, games, tools, and personal possessions. The burial chamber contained the body itself, enclosed in its nested shrines and coffins, protected by magical texts inscribed on the walls, and attended by images of the gods who would guide the dead king through the underworld. The treasury contained the objects that served the most sacred functions of the funerary ritual: the canopic jars, the shabti figures, and the most theologically significant artifacts. The annex, the most disordered of the 4 rooms, contained additional offerings, supplies, and equipment. The systematic arrangement of the objects within the tomb provides evidence that the burial was conducted according to a specific ritual protocol, a script that prescribed the type, the quantity, and the placement of every object. The protocol was the product of centuries of funerary tradition, refined by generations of priests and scribes, who had codified the Egyptian understanding of death into a comprehensive system of beliefs, rituals, and material requirements. The tomb of Tutankhamun is the single most complete, the most coherent, and the most archaeologically informative surviving implementation of this system. And its survival allows us to see the system in its entirety, rather than in the fragments that the tomb robbers left behind in every other royal burial. The tomb survived, in a valley where every other royal burial had been systematically looted, where the tomb robbers of ancient Egypt had, over the course of centuries, stripped every other tomb of its treasures, removed every other mummy from its coffin, and left nothing behind but empty corridors and ransacked chambers. The tomb of Tutankhamun survived essentially intact. Not completely intact, there is evidence that tomb robbers entered the tomb at least twice in antiquity, shortly after the burial, and that the necropolis officials resealed the tomb after each intrusion. But substantially intact, the vast majority, perhaps 95% or more, of the more than 5,000 individual artifacts that Carter and his team catalogued over the course of a decade were still in place, still packed into the 4 small rooms, still arranged in the patterns that the burial party had carefully and ritually established more than 3,200 years before. The survival of the tomb was an accident, a consequence of geography, geology, and the construction practices of a later pharaoh. The tomb of Ramesses VI, built approximately 200 years after Tutankhamun's burial, was carved directly above and slightly to one side of KV62, a tomb that Ramesses VI's builders almost certainly did not know existed, because the entrance had already been buried by the natural accumulation of debris from flash floods and from the previous construction activity in the valley. The construction debris from the later tomb, the limestone chips, and the rubble that the builders of Ramesses VI's tomb had discarded, had spilled downhill and covered the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb, burying it under several meters of debris and rendering it invisible to the generations of tomb robbers who had operated in the valley from the end of the New Kingdom to the Ptolemaic period, and, beyond, tomb robbers whose systematic, persistent, and ultimately successful efforts to breach the defences of every other royal burial in the valley constitute one of the most impressive criminal enterprises in the history of the ancient world of ancient Egypt. The professional criminals who had operated in the Valley of the Kings for centuries, who had systematically plundered every single other royal burial in the valley, who had defeated every security measure that the Egyptian state had devised, and who had stripped every pharaoh from Thutmose I to Ramesses XI of the treasures that the state had buried with them. The entrance remained buried for more than 3,000 years, hidden not by a curse or by divine protection, but by the simple, accidental, mechanically inevitable consequence of building one tomb above another. And it gets worse, or rather, it gets more remarkable, because the survival of the tomb means that we have, in the case of Tutankhamun, something that we have for virtually no other pharaoh in the history of ancient Egypt, a complete picture of how a king was buried. The tomb of Tutankhamun is not merely a collection of beautiful objects. It is a document, a record, a 3-dimensional text that describes, in physical form, the rituals, the beliefs, the technologies, and the aesthetic values of the Egyptian funerary tradition at a specific moment in history. Every object in the tomb, from the golden mask to the walking sticks, from the linen underwear to the dried bouquets of flowers, from the model boats to the miniature gilded coffins containing the carefully mummified bodies of two stillborn infant daughters, girls who were never named in the surviving records, who never drew breath, and whose tiny bodies were preserved and buried alongside their father with the same care and the same funerary ritual that the Egyptian tradition demanded for any member of the royal family, regardless of age or status, tells us something about what the Egyptians believed about death, about the afterlife, about the obligations of the living to the dead, and about the immense resources that the most powerful civilization in the ancient world was willing to devote to the care of a boy who had died at 19. The discovery of the tomb on the 4th of November 1922 was the culmination of years of frustration, false starts, and diminishing financial support. Howard Carter had been searching the Valley of the Kings, the royal necropolis on the west bank of the Nile opposite Luxor, where the pharaohs of the New Kingdom had been buried for more than 4 centuries, for more than 5 increasingly frustrating years. Methodically, systematically, section by section, clearing away rubble, examining rock formations, following leads that led nowhere, and exhausting the patience, the budget, and the confidence of his patron, Lord Carnarvon, a wealthy English aristocrat whose interest in Egyptology had been sparked by the winters he spent in Egypt for the sake of his health, and whose willingness to fund Carter's excavations was based on a combination of genuine intellectual curiosity, the social prestige that association with a major archaeological discovery would confer, and the hope, increasingly faint as the years passed and the results failed to materialize, that the investment would eventually produce a return in the form of the most coveted, the most elusive, and the most historically significant prize in Egyptology, a royal tomb that the tomb robbers had missed. The Valley of the Kings, by the time Carter began his systematic search, was widely believed to have been exhausted, to have yielded all the tombs that it had to give, to have been so thoroughly explored and so comprehensively looted that nothing of significance remained to be found. The American archaeologist Theodore Davis, who had held the concession to excavate in the valley before Carnarvon, had announced in 1912 that the valley was now exhausted, a pronouncement that the majority of professional Egyptologists at the time accepted as authoritative, and that made Carter's continued insistence that the tomb of Tutankhamun was still out there seem, to many of his colleagues, like the stubbornness of a man who could not accept that his theory was wrong. By the autumn of 1922, Carnarvon had informed Carter that the current season would be the last, that the money had run out, that the results had been insufficient, and that the excavation would end if nothing was found. The financial pressure was real. Carnarvon had spent, by some estimates, more than £50,000, an enormous fortune in the currency of the early 20th century, equivalent to several million in modern terms, on the excavation over the course of 5 increasingly disappointing seasons, a substantial fortune in the currency of the time, and the lack of significant results had made it increasingly difficult for the aristocrat to justify the continued expenditure to himself or to his advisors. The intellectual justification for Carter's persistence was a small but suggestive body of evidence that the tomb of Tutankhamun might still be in the valley, evidence that included a faience cup bearing Tutankhamun's name that Theodore Davis had found in 1905, a small cache of embalming materials inscribed with Tutankhamun's cartouche that Davis had found in 1907, and a few other fragments that suggested the presence of a Tutankhamun burial in the vicinity. Carter had mapped the areas of the valley that remained unexcavated and had identified a triangular section near the entrance to the tomb of Ramesses VI that had not been systematically explored, a section that had been partially covered by the stone huts of the workers who had built the later tomb. It was this section, this last unexplored triangle of valley floor, that Carter intended to excavate in his final season. Carter's professional reputation was also at stake. He had committed himself publicly to the belief that the tomb of Tutankhamun was still in the Valley of the Kings, a belief that many of his colleagues considered naive or delusional, and the failure to find the tomb after 5 years of systematic searching was beginning to undermine his standing in the small and intensely competitive world of British Egyptology. Carter was desperate, a professional archaeologist at the end of his rope, staking everything on one final season in a valley that most of his colleagues believed had been exhausted of its secrets. The water boy, a young Egyptian worker, whose name, according to some accounts, was Hussein Abdel Rasoul, was digging a pit to hold the jars of water that the excavation team would need during the day's work when he uncovered the first step. Carter was summoned. He supervised the clearing of the staircase, 16 steps descending into the rock, leading to a sealed doorway that bore the impressions of the necropolis seal and the cartouche of Tutankhamun, a name that Carter recognized immediately, a name that told him that the tomb before him was the tomb he had been searching for, the tomb that his colleagues had said did not exist, the tomb that his patron had been ready to give up on. Carter's private emotions at that extraordinary moment, the combination of professional vindication, personal relief, and the almost overwhelming excitement of a man who has spent years searching for something and who suddenly finds it within his grasp, can only be imagined. He did not break through the door. He did not rush forward. He did the hardest thing an archaeologist can do. At the moment of discovery, he stopped. He covered the staircase with sand, posted guards, and waited for Lord Carnarvon to arrive from England. Carter paused. He did not break through the doorway. Instead, he sent a telegram to Lord Carnarvon in England, a telegram that said, in the measured, understated language of a man who understood the magnitude of what he had found, "At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact, recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations." The restraint of the telegram, its understatement, its professional composure, its refusal to indulge in the kind of exclamatory language that the magnitude of the discovery would have justified, is itself a testament to Carter's character and to the discipline that would make the subsequent excavation one of the most carefully conducted in the history of archaeology. Carnarvon arrived in Egypt on the 23rd of November. 3 days later, on the 26th of November 1922, Carter and Carnarvon stood together before the sealed inner doorway of the tomb. Carter made a small hole in the upper left corner of the blocked entrance. He inserted a candle into the darkness. The flame flickered, then steadied, illuminated by the objects that filled the room beyond. Carnarvon, standing behind Carter, asked the question that has become the most famous line in the entire history of archaeological exploration. "Can you see anything?" Carter replied, in words that he later recorded, with characteristic understatement in his journal. Yes, wonderful things. The wonderful things that Carter saw through the hole in the doorway constituted the single greatest, the most dramatic, and the most culturally consequential archaeological discovery of the modern era, and one of the most important discoveries in the entire history of human exploration of and engagement with the ancient past, and one of the greatest in the entire history of human exploration. The antechamber alone contained enough objects to fill a museum. Golden couches in the form of animals, disassembled chariots, inlaid chests, alabaster vases, bouquets of dried flowers, food offerings, model boats, ceremonial weapons, and 2 life-sized guardian statues of the king, carved from wood and covered in black resin and gold, standing sentinel on either side of the sealed entrance to the burial chamber, their dark faces gleaming in the candlelight, their golden kilts reflecting the flame, their eyes staring forward with an expression of alert, protective vigilance that was designed to guard the pharaoh's eternal rest, and that succeeded, through accident and the blind fortune of geology, for more than 3,200 years, in maintaining the sacred boundary between the living and the dead. The antechamber also contained objects of a more personal nature, objects that remind us that the tomb was not merely a repository of royal regalia, but the final resting place of a teenager who had lived a brief and difficult life. There were board games. The ancient Egyptian game of senet, beautifully crafted in ebony and ivory, a game that the boy king may have played during the long hours of his convalescence. There were linen garments, including the boy's childhood clothing, garments from when he was a small child, carefully folded, preserved, and stored alongside the adult possessions, as if the people who buried him could not bear to leave behind even the most ordinary artifacts of his too short life. There were dried bouquets of flowers, wreaths and garlands of cornflowers, lotus blossoms and olive leaves that had been placed on the coffins at the time of the burial and that had survived, desiccated but intact, for more than 3,000 years. The flowers are among the most poignant, the most emotionally affecting, the most humanly meaningful, and the most universally understandable objects in the entire tomb, not because they are valuable or artistically beautiful or theologically significant, but because they are fragile, temporary, and human, the kind of gesture that any grieving family might make for any beloved dead, regardless of rank or wealth or the number of gold artifacts that surrounded them. The annex, a small side chamber accessible through a low doorway from the antechamber, contained a chaotic jumble of objects that had been thrown into the room with considerably less care than objects in the antechamber. Jars of wine, containers of food, baskets of fruit, boxes of jewelry, ceremonial weapons, alabaster vessels, and dozens of other objects were piled on top of each other in apparent disorder, a contrast to the careful arrangement of the antechamber that may reflect the haste with which the burial was completed, or the disorder left behind by the tomb robbers who had breached the outer rooms in antiquity. Thieves who had apparently been interrupted by the necropolis guards before they could reach the burial chamber, and who had left behind evidence of their intrusion in the form of disordered objects, displaced wrappings, and a hastily resealed entrance. The treasury, the small chamber beyond the burial chamber, contained some of the most beautiful and most emotionally resonant objects in the entire tomb. The canopic shrine, an elaborate gilded wooden structure that housed the 4 canopic jars containing Tutankhamun's preserved internal organs, was guarded by 4 gilded wooden statues of goddesses, their arms outstretched in protective gestures, their faces serene and compassionate, their bodies turned slightly inward as if shielding the pharaoh's organs from harm. The canopic shrine is one of the masterpieces of Egyptian funerary art, a work of such extraordinary, almost transcendent, and almost supernaturally accomplished beauty, such breathtaking and historically unprecedented technical refinement, and such profound theological sophistication, that it has been described by scholars as one of the finest examples of ancient Egyptian craftsmanship ever discovered. Also in the treasury were the 2 miniature coffins containing the mummified remains of the 2 stillborn daughters, a detail of heartbreaking intimacy that reminds us that the boy buried in this tomb was not merely a pharaoh but a father, a young man who had tried to produce an heir and who had lost both children before they were born. The systematic clearance of the tomb took Howard Carter and his team nearly a decade, 10 years of painstaking, meticulous, and at times agonizingly slow work that set the standard for modern archaeological excavation, and that produced a photographic and documentary record of the tomb's contents that remains one of the most important photographic archives in the history of Egyptology. The Griffith Institute at the University of Oxford now maintains the Carter Archive, including Burton's photographs, Carter's journals, his object cards, and the detailed notes that he compiled for each of the more than 5,000 artifacts, making the documentary record of the Tutankhamun excavation one of the most accessible and the most thoroughly preserved records of any archaeological project in history. The photographer Harry Burton, assigned to the project by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, produced more than 3,000 photographs of the tomb and its contents. Images that documented every object in situ before it was removed, every wall painting, every inscription, every fragment of every artifact. The photographs are themselves works of art, luminous, beautifully composed images that capture the beauty and the poignancy of the objects with a clarity and a sensitivity that have not been surpassed by the thousands of photographs that have been taken of the tomb and its contents in the century since the discovery. Burton's images are important not merely as aesthetic objects. They are scientific documents of the first order, providing the only visual record of the tomb's contents in their original positions and configurations, recording the spatial relationships between objects that were subsequently separated, transported, and displayed in different locations. Without Burton's photographs, the archaeological context of the tomb's contents, the crucial information encoded in the exact placement, the precise orientation, and the specific spatial relationships, the orientation, and the association of objects within the rooms, would have been lost forever, and our understanding of the tomb as a coherent theological system, rather than a mere collection of beautiful artifacts, would have been immeasurably diminished. The clearance of the antechamber, the first and the most visually overwhelming of the four rooms, took approximately 7 weeks of painstaking work. Every object had to be photographed in place, drawn, numbered and catalogued before it could be removed. Many of the objects were fragile. The wood had dried out over 3 millennia, the linen had become brittle, the leather had cracked, the adhesives that held inlays and decorative elements in place had lost their strength. Carter and his conservators developed techniques for preserving and transporting the objects that were unprecedented in archaeological practice. Wrapping fragile items in cotton and wax, constructing custom-built wooden trays and boxes for transport, and applying conservation treatments that stabilized the materials before they were moved. The care and the professionalism of Carter's approach to the clearance, at a time when many archaeological excavations were conducted with a speed and a casualness that would horrify modern practitioners, is one of the most enduring and the most admirable achievements of the Tutankhamun excavation. Achievements that are all the more impressive given Carter's difficult personality, his combative relationship with the press, his strained relations with the Egyptian government, and the political controversies that repeatedly threatened to derail the excavation. And one of the reasons why the objects survive in such extraordinary, almost miraculous condition in the carefully climate-controlled museums, the state-of-the-art conservation laboratories, and the meticulously curated exhibition halls where they are studied, conserved, photographed, and reverently displayed for the education and the wonder of the modern world today. The opening of the burial chamber, the moment that Carter and Carnarvon had been anticipating for 3 months, the moment when they would learn whether the inner chambers were intact or whether the tomb robbers had reached the sarcophagus, occurred on the 16th of February, 1923, was one of the most dramatic, the most emotionally overwhelming, and the most historically significant moments in the entire history of modern archaeology. Carter and his team had spent weeks clearing the antechamber, knowing that the sealed wall at the far end concealed something, but not knowing, not with certainty, whether the burial behind that wall was intact, or whether the tomb robbers who had breached the outer rooms had also reached the inner chambers. When Carter finally broke through the sealed wall, in the presence of Lord Carnarvon, his daughter Lady Evelyn Herbert, the Egyptian official Pierre Lacour, and a carefully selected group of dignitaries and Egyptological colleagues and invited guests, what he saw was overwhelming. An enormous gilded shrine, the first of 4 enormous, elaborately decorated, and magnificently gilded nested shrines, each one fitting inside the next like a set of golden boxes, filled nearly the entire burial chamber, leaving barely enough room to walk around its edges. The shrine was more than 5 meters long, more than 3 meters wide, and more than 2.5 meters high, a structure of such monumental scale, such elaborate decoration, and such overwhelming visual impact that it seemed almost impossible that it could have been assembled in the small chamber that contained it. Inside the 4 nested shrines lay a quartzite sarcophagus. Inside the sarcophagus lay 3 nested coffins, the outer 2 made of gilded wood, the innermost made of solid gold, weighing approximately 110 kilograms. The opening of the nested coffins, a process that required weeks of careful work, specialized tools, and the constant presence of conservators, revealed progressively more elaborate and more beautiful containers, each one decorated with more gold, more inlays, and more intricate craftsmanship than the last. The innermost coffin, made of solid gold, its surface burnished to a warm, luminous glow that photographs cannot fully capture, is one of the largest and most valuable gold objects ever produced by any ancient civilization. A single, breathtaking piece of metalwork that represents the accumulated skill of generations of Egyptian goldsmiths working at the absolute peak of their craft. The wall paintings in the burial chamber, the only decorated chamber in the tomb, are of particular interest because they appear to have been executed hastily, with a speed and a simplicity that contrast sharply with the elaborate and meticulously detailed paintings that characterize the tombs of the great pharaohs. The paintings depict several scenes from the funerary ritual, including the famous and politically charged scene of the elderly courtier A performing the opening of the mouth ceremony on the mummified Tutankhamun, a ritual scene that has been interpreted by scholars as a political statement as well as a theological one, because it shows A assuming the role traditionally reserved for the first son and heir, thereby establishing his claim to the succession in the most visible and the most permanent way possible. The haste of the paintings, the drips of paint, the corrections, the areas of unfinished detail, suggests that the burial was conducted under time pressure, possibly because the embalming process had taken the full 70 days that tradition prescribed, and the tomb needed to be sealed before the political situation changed. The opening of the nested coffins was itself one of the most dramatic sequences in the history of the excavation. The outermost coffin, gilded wood elaborately carved and painted, was lifted from the sarcophagus on the 28th of October 1925, revealing the second coffin beneath it. The second coffin, also gilded wood, even more elaborately decorated than the first, was lifted to reveal the third coffin beneath it. And the third coffin, solid gold, weighing 110 kilograms, its surface warm to the touch, its features serene and timeless, was opened to reveal the mummified body of the boy king, draped in linen, adorned with jewelry and amulets, and covered with the golden death mask that would become the defining image of ancient Egypt in the modern world, an image so instantaneously famous, so universally recognized, so endlessly reproduced, and so culturally ubiquitous that it has transcended its original context and become a symbol not merely of Tutankhamun or of the 18th dynasty, but of the entire 3,000-year history of the pharaonic state and of the human fascination with the ancient past. Carter later described the moment as one of the most overwhelming experiences of his life, the culmination of years of search, months of careful clearance, and weeks of painstaking preparation, all leading to the moment when the face of a boy who had died more than 3,000 years ago was revealed to the light for the first time since the priests who had buried him had closed the coffin and sealed the tomb. Inside the innermost coffin lay the mummified body of Tutankhamun, wrapped in linen, adorned with jewelry and amulets, and covered, from shoulders to chest, with the golden death mask that would become the single most famous artifact in the entire world. The mask, 54 centimeters high, 39 centimeters wide, weighing approximately 11 kilograms, is a masterpiece of ancient metalwork. It is made of 2 sheets of gold, beaten and shaped to form the face, the headdress, and the broad collar of the pharaoh. The blue stripes of the Neem's headdress are inlaid with lapis lazuli, imported from the distant mines of Afghanistan, thousands of kilometers from the Nile Valley. The eyes are inlaid with obsidian and quartz, with red pigment at the corners to simulate the veins of the living eye. The vulture and the cobra on the forehead, the symbols of Upper and Lower Egypt, the twin guardians of the pharaoh, are rendered in gold with inlays of lapis lazuli, carnelian, and colored glass. The inscription on the back of the mask reproduces a spell from the Book of the Dead, a text that identifies the various parts of the face with specific deities, transforming the physical features of the dead king into divine attributes. Your right eye is the night bark of the sun, your left eye is the day bark, your eyebrows are those of the Ennead of gods, your forehead is that of Anubis. The spell makes explicit what the mask makes visible, that the face beneath the gold is not merely the face of a dead boy but the face of a god, a face that participates in the divine nature and that will exist, unchanging and unchangeable, throughout eternity. The tomb also contained objects of extraordinary scientific interest, most notably a dagger made from iron that was derived from a meteorite. The iron dagger, with its gold handle and its rock crystal pommel, is one of the earliest known examples of iron working in Egypt, and the fact that the iron came from a meteorite rather than from smelted ore tells us something profound about the way the Egyptians understood the relationship between the heavens and the earth. Iron from meteorites was called iron from the sky by the ancient Egyptians, a material that was understood to be literally and physically of divine origin, a gift from the gods that fell from the celestial realm to the earth, and that was, for that reason, more precious and more sacred than any terrestrial material, including gold. The overall effect is of a face that is simultaneously human and divine, a young man's features rendered with the idealized serenity of a god, looking forward into eternity with an expression of calm certainty that has captivated every human being who has ever stood before it. The analysis of Tutankhamun's mummy has been conducted multiple times since the tomb's discovery, with increasingly sophisticated technologies and with increasingly complex results. Carter's own examination of the mummy, conducted in 1925 by the anatomist Douglas Derry, was by modern standards crude. The mummy was damaged during the unwrapping process, and the examination produced results that were incomplete and, in some cases, misleading. Subsequent examinations, including X-ray studies in 1968 and 1978, a full CT scan in 2005, and the groundbreaking DNA study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2010, have progressively and sometimes dramatically refined our understanding of the boy king's physical condition, his genetic background, and the possible causes of his death. The 2005 CT scan, conducted by an Egyptian-led team under the direction of Zahi Hawass, produced more than 1,700 cross-sectional images of the mummy, a data set so extraordinarily detailed and so technologically sophisticated that it allowed researchers to reconstruct a three-dimensional model of the pharaoh's skeleton and to identify skeletal abnormalities that had been invisible to earlier examinations. The scan confirmed the clubfoot, identified the bone disease, revealed the leg fracture, and demonstrated that the pharaoh's skull was intact. A finding that effectively and conclusively ruled out the long-standing theory that Tutankhamun had been murdered by a blow to the head, a theory that had been popularized by books and television documentaries, that had fueled decades of speculation about assassination and conspiracy, and that had been based on a misinterpretation of earlier X-ray images that showed bone fragments inside the skull. The question of what was originally made for Tutankhamun and what was repurposed from other burials is one of the most intriguing, the most debated, and the most historically revealing aspects of the tomb's contents. Nicholas Reeves, a British Egyptologist, proposed in 2015 that the Golden Death Mask may not have been originally made for Tutankhamun at all, that it may have been made for Nefertiti and later adapted for the boy king's burial. Reeves pointed to several features of the mask that he argued were inconsistent with a male pharaoh, including the pierced ears, which were typical of royal women and children, but not of adult male pharaohs, and differences in the gold alloy and the blue inlay material between the face of the mask and the back, suggesting that the face had been reworked at some point. The proposal that the most famous artifact in the world may not have been made for the person it adorns is one of those archaeological revelations that challenges our assumptions about the relationship between an artifact and the individual it was created for, a revelation that seems, at first, to diminish the significance of the object, but that, on reflection, deepens it, because it suggests that the burial of Tutankhamun was itself a product of the chaotic political circumstances of the late Amarna period, a hastily assembled collection of objects gathered from multiple sources to equip a young king whose death had been unexpected and whose burial could not wait. The curse of Tutankhamun's tomb, the legend that a supernatural punishment would befall anyone who disturbed the pharaoh's rest, was a creation of the press, not of the pharaohs. The death of Lord Carnarvon on the 5th of April, 1923. Less than 5 months after the opening of the tomb was the event that triggered the curse narrative. Carnarvon died, not of a pharaoh's curse, but of a perfectly ordinary and medically explicable case of blood poisoning, an infection that began when a mosquito bite on his cheek became infected after he accidentally cut it while shaving. The infection spread, the Earl developed pneumonia, and he died in a Cairo hotel room at the age of 56. The death was sudden, unexpected, and dramatic, and it occurred close enough to the opening of the tomb to provide the press with a narrative that was irresistible. The pharaoh was taking his revenge. The novelist Marie Corelli and the creator of Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, both believers in the supernatural, added fuel to the fire, publishing statements that suggested the curse was real and that ancient Egyptian priests had placed magical protections on the tomb that were still effective 3,000 years later. The press ran with the story. "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king," was the curse inscription that newspapers attributed to the tomb, though no such inscription has ever been found on or in the tomb of Tutankhamun. The curse became a media phenomenon, a self-sustaining narrative that was fed by every subsequent death, illness, accident, or misfortune that befell anyone who had any connection, however tenuous, to the excavation. The statistical reality is far less dramatic than the legend. Of the 46 people who were present at the opening of the tomb, or had participated in the early stages of the excavation, the vast majority lived normal lives and died of natural causes at normal ages. Howard Carter himself, the man who discovered the tomb, who opened the burial chamber, who lifted the lid of the sarcophagus, who unwrapped the mummy, lived until 1939, dying at the age of 64, 17 years after the tomb's discovery. Lady Evelyn Herbert, who was among the first to enter the tomb alongside her father, lived until 1980, dying at the age of 78. The curse claimed victims selectively and conveniently, targeting those whose deaths could be linked, however tenuously, to the tomb, while ignoring the far larger number of people who were intimately involved in the excavation and who suffered no ill effects whatsoever. The most telling statistic in the debunking of the curse is the lifespan of Howard Carter himself. Carter was the man who discovered the tomb, who opened the sealed doorway, who peered into the darkness with his candle, who entered the antechamber, who broke through the wall into the burial chamber, who opened the sarcophagus, who lifted the lid of the coffin, who unwrapped the mummy, and who spent 10 years of his life in the most intimate and the most sustained contact with the tomb and its contents that any human being has ever had. If any curse existed, if any supernatural force was protecting the tomb from disturbance, Carter would have been its first and its most obvious target. Carter died in 1939 at the age of 64, 17 years after the discovery, having lived a full professional life and having completed the most important and the most celebrated archaeological excavation of the 20th century. The curse, it appears, was unable to distinguish between the man who opened the tomb and the mosquito that bit Lord Carnarvon's cheek. The curse, in other words, was a statistical illusion, a product of confirmation bias, media sensationalism, and the human tendency to find patterns in random events and to attribute meaning to coincidence. The real curse of Tutankhamun's tomb, if the word can be used at all, was not supernatural but political and professional. The discovery of the tomb triggered a bitter and prolonged dispute between Howard Carter, Lord Carnarvon's estate, the Egyptian government, and the press over the rights to access the tomb, to photograph its contents, and to publish accounts of the excavation. Carter had granted exclusive press access to the Times of London, a decision that infuriated every other newspaper in the world, and that generated a media backlash of extraordinary intensity. The Egyptian government, increasingly assertive of its rights over its own antiquities, imposed restrictions on Carter's work that he found intolerable, and that led, in 1924, to a confrontation that resulted in Carter being locked out of the tomb for nearly a year. The political drama that surrounded the excavation, the nationalism, the imperialism, the colonial dynamics, the competing claims of science and sovereignty, was, in its own way, as dramatic and as consequential as the archaeological discovery itself, and it foreshadowed the debates about cultural heritage, archaeological ethics, the ownership of the past, and the responsibility of former colonial powers to return the artifacts they acquired during the era of imperial archaeology that continue to dominate the relationship between Western museums and the governments of the countries from which their collections were originally derived. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was also a turning point in the history of the popular engagement with archaeology. The moment when the study of the ancient past ceased to be a specialized academic pursuit and became a global cultural phenomenon. The press coverage of the discovery, the breathless reports from the Times of London, the sensational coverage in the tabloid press, the photographs that were published in newspapers around the world, created a level of public interest in archaeology that had never existed before and that has never entirely subsided. The Tut mania of the 1920s, the craze for Egyptian-themed fashion, jewelry, furniture, architecture, and decorative arts that swept Europe and America in the years following the discovery, was the first example of what would become a recurring pattern and in the history of popular culture. The transformation of an archaeological discovery into a mass-market phenomenon, a process that the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb inaugurated, and that subsequent discoveries, from the Dead Sea Scrolls to the terracotta warriors to the tomb of the Lord of Sipan, have replicated but never surpassed. The Egyptomania that the tomb's discovery unleashed has not faded. It has evolved, adapted, and renewed itself through a century of museum exhibitions, Hollywood films, television documentaries, popular books, and now digital media. The golden mask of Tutankhamun remains the most reproduced and the most commercially exploited image from the ancient world, appearing on everything from museum posters to coffee mugs to children's Halloween costumes. The irony of this commercial ubiquity, the fact that the most widely reproduced image from ancient Egypt is the face of one of its least significant pharaohs, is itself a commentary on the relationship between historical significance and popular fame, between the accomplishments of the living and the survival of the dead, between what a civilization values about its past and what accident and commerce determine that the world will actually remember, a relationship that the tomb of Tutankhamun has permanently and irreversibly complicated, enriched, and disrupted. The cultural heritage questions raised by the tomb extend beyond the specific artifacts to the broader question of how the modern world should engage with the material remains of ancient civilizations, a question that becomes more urgent, more politically charged, and more philosophically complex with each passing decade. The Egyptian government has argued, with increasing force and increasing international support, that the artifacts from Tutankhamun's tomb should remain in Egypt, displayed in Egyptian museums, interpreted by Egyptian scholars, and understood within the cultural context from which they originated. The argument is not merely political, it is philosophical, resting on the principle that the objects belong to the civilization that created them, and that their meaning is inseparable from the cultural, geographical, and spiritual context in which they were produced. The objects survive, but they survive in a context that their creators never imagined and never intended. The question of where the artifacts should be displayed, a question that has been debated for a century and that remains unresolved, is itself a legacy of the discovery. The golden mask and the other major artifacts from the tomb were housed for decades in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, a 19th century building that was never designed to accommodate the volume of visitors that the Tutankhamun collection attracted. The new Grand Egyptian Museum at Giza, one of the largest archaeological museums in the world, designed specifically to house the Tutankhamun collection, along with thousands of other Egyptian artifacts, represents the culmination of decades of planning and billions of dollars of investment, a monument to the enduring and apparently inexhaustible fascination that the Boy King's tomb continues to exert on the modern world more than a century after its discovery. The objects themselves have had their own adventures in the century since their discovery, adventures that have included damage, restoration, controversy, and the evolving politics of cultural heritage. The Golden Death Mask was damaged in 2014, when museum workers accidentally knocked off the ceremonial beard and hastily reattached it with improper adhesive, an incident that produced headlines around the world, and that required a meticulous restoration by a German conservation team. The fact that the damage to a 3,300-year-old artifact could generate global media coverage is itself a testament to the extraordinary cultural significance that the mask has acquired, a significance that extends far beyond the Egyptian archaeological community. and that has made the mask a symbol not merely of ancient Egypt, but of the fragility and the importance of cultural heritage worldwide. And now we arrive at the question that has been building through this long night. The question that the golden mask, the ransacked antechamber, the nested coffins, the walking sticks, and the broken bones of a teenage boy all converge upon. A question that is not about curses or gold or the drama of archaeological discovery, but about something far more fundamental and far more unsettling. Why do we remember Tutankhamun? The answer is not what we might expect, and it reveals something important about the way human civilizations remember their dead and about the role that accident, chance, and the arbitrary survival of physical evidence play in determining which individuals are remembered and which are forgotten. We remember Tutankhamun, the sick boy, the puppet king, the disabled teenager, not because of what he accomplished during his brief and largely unremarkable reign. His accomplishments were modest. His reign was brief. His personal achievements, if he had any beyond the passive endorsement of the policies that his advisors designed and implemented, are virtually unknown. We remember him because of what survived, because the construction debris from a later pharaoh's tomb, ordinary limestone rubble, and rock chips from the excavation of the tomb of Ramesses VI, discarded by construction workers who had absolutely no idea what lay beneath the ground they were working on, accidentally but effectively buried the entrance to his small, modestly located, and architecturally unremarkable tomb, because the tomb robbers who plundered every other burial in the valley failed to find his, because the 4 small rooms beneath the sand preserved, for more than 3,000 years, the most complete royal burial ever discovered in the entire history of Egyptian archaeology. An intact time capsule from the 14th century BC, sealed and preserved and waiting in the darkness for more than 3,200 years. The accident of survival is the key to the entire story, and it is, when you think about it, one of the most disturbing aspects of the way human history works. The great pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, Thutmose III, who conquered an empire, Amenhotep III, who built the Golden Age, Hatshepsut, who ruled as pharaoh in her own right, are remembered by scholars but unknown to the general public. Their tombs were looted, their treasures were stolen, their mummies were stripped and rewrapped and hidden in caches by necropolis officials who were trying to protect them from the very tomb robbers who had already destroyed their burials. The great pharaohs are shadows, names in king lists, inscriptions on walls, broken statues in museums. Tutankhamun, the least significant pharaoh of the dynasty, is a global celebrity. His face the single most recognized, most widely reproduced, and most commercially exploited image from the ancient world, his name known to school children on every continent. The inversion is complete, and it is entirely a product of accident. Let that sink in. The fame of the most famous pharaoh in history is not a reflection of his historical significance. It is a reflection of the survival of his tomb. If the construction workers who built the tomb of Ramesses VI had dumped their debris in a slightly different direction, if the rubble had fallen 10 meters to the left or the right, the tomb of Tutankhamun would have been found and plundered in antiquity, just like every other tomb in the valley. The golden mask would have been melted down, the coffins would have been stripped of their gold, the mummy would have been rewrapped and hidden in a cache with the other displaced royals, and Tutankhamun would be what he was for 3,000 years before Carter's discovery. A forgotten name on a damaged stele, an erasure in the king lists, a footnote in the history of the 18th dynasty. This is not science fiction. This is the reality of how historical memory works, how the survival or loss of physical evidence determines, with a randomness that should make every historian uncomfortable, which individuals are remembered and which are forgotten. The accident of preservation is the engine of fame, and the accident of destruction is the engine of oblivion. The pharaohs who built the greatest tombs, the vast multi-corridored, elaborately decorated subterranean palaces that the great rulers of the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties carved into the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, are the pharaohs whose burials were most systematically looted, because the very magnificence of their tombs made them the primary targets of the tomb robbers who operated in the valley from the end of the New Kingdom onward. The pharaoh who was buried in the smallest, the least elaborate, and the most inconspicuously located tomb in the valley is the pharaoh whose burial survived, and who became, as a result, the most famous ruler of the ancient world. The pharaohs who built the greatest empires, who composed the greatest texts, who presided over the greatest achievements of human civilization, are forgotten. The boy who inherited a broken kingdom, who could barely walk, who died at 19, and who was buried in a hastily prepared tomb with repurposed artifacts, is the most famous ruler of the ancient world. The irony is absolute, and it is, when you consider it carefully, one of the most important, the most sobering, and the most humbling truths that the study of the past can teach us about the fragility, the contingency, and the fundamental arbitrariness of historical memory. The tomb also raises questions about the nature of the objects themselves, about the meaning and the purpose of the more than 5,000 individual artifacts, each one numbered, photographed, drawn, described, conserved, and catalogued with the painstaking thoroughness that has made the Tutankhamun excavation the gold standard of archaeological practice. That Carter and his team processed over a full decade of painstaking, meticulous, and often physically exhausting work. The objects in the tomb were not merely possessions. They were theological instruments, tools designed to facilitate the pharaoh's perilous, theologically essential, and mythologically complex journey through the dark, dangerous, and demon-infested underworld, and to equip him for eternal life in the company of the gods. The model boats were not toys. They were vehicles for the dead king's journey across the celestial waters. The food offerings were not gestures of sentiment. They were sustenance for the ka, the life force, that would need to eat and drink in the afterlife, just as it had in life. The Shapti figures, the small mummiform statuettes found in the tomb by the hundreds, were not decorative objects. They were magical servants, imbued with the power to perform agricultural labor on behalf of the dead king in the field of reeds, so that the pharaoh himself would never have to work in the afterlife. Every object had a function. Every placement had a meaning. The tomb was not a museum. It was a machine, a carefully calibrated system of objects and rituals designed to achieve a specific and clearly defined theological outcome. The transformation of a dead boy, a mortal, imperfect, genetically compromised teenager who had spent his brief life in physical pain and political dependency, into an immortal, perfected, eternally youthful God who would live forever in the company of the divine beings who populated the Egyptian afterlife. The faith that drove this extraordinary, almost incomprehensible investment of resources, a faith so deep, so comprehensive, and so materially consequential that it shaped every aspect of Egyptian civilization, from the economy to the art to the architecture to the social structure. The belief that death was not the end, that the dead continued to exist in another realm, that the objects placed in the tomb would accompany the deceased into eternity, is one of the defining characteristics of ancient Egyptian civilization, and one of the most important keys to understanding its culture, its economy, and its priorities. The amount of wealth that the Egyptian state devoted to the care of its dead, the gold, the lapis lazuli, the cedar, the linen, the food, the labor, the artistic skill, the administrative organization, represents a staggering commitment of resources that no other ancient civilization matched, and that reveals a set of values, a hierarchy of priorities, and a conception of death and eternity that are fundamentally and perhaps irreconcilably different from those of the modern, secular, materialistic world. The Egyptians did not merely believe in the afterlife. They invested in it with a material generosity and an institutional commitment that transformed the funerary tradition from a religious practice into an economic system, a cultural institution, and a defining characteristic of the civilization itself. The tomb of Tutankhamun, then, is not merely the burial of a boy king. It is a monument to a belief system, a physical manifestation of a civilization's deepest convictions about the nature of death and the possibility of eternal life. The fact that this monument survived, that it was preserved through accident and geological fortune for more than 3,000 years, while every other monument of its kind was destroyed, makes it not merely a treasure trove, but a theological document, a scientific resource, and a testament to the extraordinary lengths to which the Egyptian civilization was willing to go in pursuit of a goal that the modern world can admire but cannot fully comprehend: the defeat of death. Let that sink in. The Egyptian state, the most powerful, the most wealthy, and the most administratively sophisticated state in the ancient world, devoted an enormous portion of its total economic output to the single purpose of defeating death. The tombs, the mummies, the coffins, the masks, the amulets, the shabti figures, the food offerings, the model boats, the funerary texts, the temples, the priesthoods, the rituals, the festivals, all of this vast and magnificent apparatus was designed, built, maintained, and operated for the single purpose of ensuring that the dead would live again. The tomb of Tutankhamun is the most complete surviving expression of this system, the one case in which we can see the entire apparatus in place, functioning as it was designed to function, fulfilling the purpose for which it was created. And the fact that it was created for a boy, a sick, disabled, genetically compromised teenager who died before he reached the age of 20, makes it, paradoxically, all the more powerful as a testament to the faith that produced it. Because if the Egyptian state was willing to invest this much in the afterlife of one of its least significant pharaohs, what would it have invested in the afterlife of a Thutmose III or an Amenhotep III, pharaohs whose tombs were looted, whose treasures were stolen, and whose afterlife preparations we can only imagine? The tomb of Tutankhamun is, in this sense, both a treasure and a torment. A treasure because it preserves what no other tomb preserves, and a torment because it reminds us, with every golden object and every delicate amulet, of the unimaginable wealth that was buried with the greater pharaohs, and that is now gone forever, melted down by tomb robbers, dispersed into the anonymous currents of ancient commerce, and lost to the silence of time. The relationship between the boy king and his father, between the son who restored the traditional gods and the father who had tried to destroy them, adds another layer of meaning to the tomb and its contents. Tutankhamun was buried with objects that reflected the restored traditional religion, with images of Osiris, with texts from the Book of the Dead, with amulets and figurines that represented the traditional afterlife beliefs that Akhenaten had suppressed. The boy who was born Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, was buried as Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, with every element of the traditional funerary apparatus in place, with every trace of his father's revolutionary theology removed, and with the afterlife that his father's austere and exclusively solar theology had denied, was now fully, lavishly, and comprehensively provided, with gold, with texts, with amulets, with rituals, and with the complete apparatus of the traditional Egyptian funerary tradition, restored in all its theological richness and material splendor. The burial was an act of comprehensive theological correction, a deliberate, visible, and materially extravagant statement, made in gold and stone, and painted wood and sacred text and painted wood, that the heretic pharaoh's revolution was over, and that the traditional order had been permanently and comprehensively restored. The numbers are striking. The golden death mask alone, 11 kilograms of solid gold, represents an investment of precious metal that would have taken an Egyptian gold miner years to extract from the mines of Nubia. The solid gold in a coffin, 110 kilograms, represents an investment so vast that it is difficult to comprehend in modern terms, not merely because of the monetary value of the gold, but because of the labor, the skill, the time, and the organizational capacity required to mine it, refine it, transport it, and shape it into a single, magnificent, theologically purposeful object. The total weight of gold in the tomb, including the mask, the coffin, the shrines, the jewelry, the figurines, and the hundreds of smaller gold objects, has been estimated at well over 200 kilograms, a staggering concentration of precious metal that represents an enormous and historically significant portion of the Egyptian state's total gold reserves, and that testifies to the extraordinary value that the Egyptian civilization placed on the proper burial of its kings. But the tomb of Tutankhamun tells us something else as well, something that goes beyond the irony of fame and the accidents of preservation. The tomb tells us about the civilization that produced it, about the beliefs, the values, the technologies, and the extraordinary resources that the Egyptian state was willing to devote to the burial of a single individual, even a young and relatively unimportant one. The more than 5,000 objects found in the tomb represent not merely the personal possessions of a deceased pharaoh, they represent the output of an entire civilization's industrial, artistic, and religious capacity, directed toward the single purpose of ensuring that the dead king would have everything he needed in the afterlife. The craftsmanship of the objects, the precision of the goldwork, the delicacy of the inlays, the sophistication of the joinery, the beauty of the painted surfaces, represents the accumulated skill, the refined technique, and the artistic tradition of generations of Egyptian craftsmen, goldsmiths, carpenters, painters, jewelers, weavers, metalworkers, and stone carvers, working at the absolute highest level of their considerable ability, producing objects of such quality that they remain, after more than 3,000 years, among the finest works of decorative art ever produced by any civilization. We have followed Tutankhamun from his birth in the chaos of the Amarna revolution to his burial in the Valley of the Kings, from the heretic city in the desert to the golden chambers beneath the rock, from the broken body of a boy who could barely walk to the serene golden face that has stared into eternity for more than 3,000 years. We have seen the reign, the restoration of the traditional gods, the reopening of the temples, the reversal of his father's revolution, conducted not by the boy king himself, but by the advisors who governed in his name. We have seen the tomb, the 4 small rooms packed with more than 5,000 objects, the nested shrines and coffins, the golden mask, the walking sticks, the dried flowers, the model boats, the miniature coffins of the 2 stillborn daughters. We have seen the discovery, Carter and Carnarvon, the water boy and the stone step, the telegram and the candle and the wonderful things. And we have seen the curse, the media creation that turned a mosquito bite and a shaving accident into a supernatural legend that has endured for a century. What does this remarkable, this paradoxical, this deeply instructive, and this endlessly fascinating story mean? It means that the relationship between historical significance and historical fame is not what we think it is, that the pharaohs we remember are not necessarily the pharaohs who mattered, and that the pharaohs who shaped the course of history, who built the empires, who composed the theological texts, and who transformed the civilization are not necessarily the pharaohs whose names and whose faces are known to the modern world. Historical fame is not a reward for historical significance. It is a consequence of the survival of evidence, and the survival of evidence is a product of accident, contingency, and the blind, mindless, and entirely impersonal mechanical processes of geology and construction that no human agency can predict or control. Tutankhamun is famous because his tomb survived. Thutmose III, the Napoleon of Egypt, the pharaoh who conquered more territory and built more monuments than any ruler in Egyptian history, is virtually unknown to the general public because his tomb was looted and his treasures were stolen. The fame of one and the obscurity of the other have nothing to do with their respective accomplishments and everything to do with the accident of preservation. The random, mechanical, geologically trivial fact that construction debris fell in one direction rather than another, and buried an entrance rather than leaving it exposed. It means that our understanding of the past is shaped by what survives rather than by what existed, that the picture of ancient Egypt that the modern world carries in its collective imagination is not a picture of ancient Egypt as it actually was, but a picture of the specific, limited, and arbitrarily selected fragments of ancient Egypt that happened to survive the 3,000 years between the last pharaoh and the first Egyptologist. The golden mask of Tutankhamun is the face of ancient Egypt in the modern imagination, but it is the face of a boy who was, by the standards of his own civilization, one of the least important pharaohs who ever wore the double crown. The tomb that produced the most famous artifacts in the world was one of the smallest and least elaborate royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The pharaoh who became the symbol of Egyptian civilization was a teenager whose own successors tried to erase his name from the historical record. The irony is not merely amusing, it is instructive. It tells us something important about the way human beings construct the past, about the role that physical evidence plays in shaping historical narrative, and about the danger of confusing the survival of artifacts with the significance, the complexity, the beauty, and the intellectual depth of the vast, complex, and endlessly fascinating civilization that produced them. The tomb of Tutankhamun does not tell us what ancient Egypt was like at its most magnificent. It tells us what ancient Egypt was like when it was burying one of its least significant, least powerful, and least personally accomplished pharaohs in one of its smallest tombs under circumstances of political uncertainty and dynastic crisis. The magnificence of the tomb, the gold, the craftsmanship, the beauty, the theological sophistication, is the magnificence of the minimum, not the maximum. And if the minimum is this extraordinary, the maximum, the tombs of the great pharaohs, the burials that we will never see, must have been beyond anything that the modern imagination can conceive. The tomb also forces us to confront the question of preservation, the question of what we owe to the objects that the past has given us, and what responsibilities the present bears toward the material heritage of civilizations that no longer exist. The objects in Tutankhamun's tomb were made for a specific purpose: to accompany the dead king into the afterlife and to serve him in eternity. They were not made to be displayed in museums, photographed by tourists, studied by scholars, or reproduced on coffee mugs. The removal of the objects from the tomb, their transport to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, their display in glass cases, their exposure to the light and the air, and the curious gaze of millions of visitors, represents a fundamental transformation of their purpose and their meaning, a transformation that the people who made them, the goldsmiths, the carpenters, the painters, the jewelers whose names are lost but whose skill is immortalized in every object, and the priests who placed them in the tomb with the reverence and the theological certainty that the funerary ritual demanded, could never have imagined, never have intended, and never have approved. The mask was made for eternity, for the eternal, unchanging darkness of the tomb, for the eyes of the gods rather than the eyes of tourists. It now sits in a glass case under artificial lights, viewed by millions of people every year, its purpose transformed from theological instrument to aesthetic object, its context stripped away, its meaning altered, its beauty preserved, but its function lost. The objects survive, but they survive in a context that is completely different from the one for which they were created. The golden mask still exists. The theological system that gave it meaning does not. The tomb of Tutankhamun is extraordinary, but it is extraordinary precisely because it is unique, because it is the only substantially intact royal burial to survive from the entire 3,000-year history of the pharaonic state. The other tombs, the tombs of the great pharaohs, the tombs that would have contained treasures that dwarfed even the magnificent contents of KV-62, are gone. Their treasures were melted down, their objects dispersed, their mummies stripped and displaced, their chambers ransacked and emptied by the tomb robbers, who, for all their criminality, were performing the inevitable historical function of recycling the accumulated wealth of the dead for the use of the living. The destruction of the other tombs is itself a historical document, a testament to the immense wealth that the Egyptian funerary tradition generated, to the irresistible temptation that the concentrated treasures of the royal burials represented, and to the persistent, systematic, and ultimately successful efforts of generations of tomb robbers to breach the defenses that the necropolis officials had constructed to protect the dead. The survival of Tutankhamun's tomb is the exception, the one case in which the defenses held, not because they were stronger than the others, but because they were accidentally reinforced by the construction debris of a later pharaoh. The tomb survived not because it was better protected, but because it was better hidden. Hidden not by design, but by accident, not by the intelligence of the builders, but by the indifference of geology. The question of what the other royal tombs contained, a question that the survival of Tutankhamun's tomb forces us to confront, is one of the most tantalizing in the study of ancient Egypt. If the tomb of Tutankhamun, one of the smallest and least elaborate royal burials in the valley, prepared in haste for a minor pharaoh, contained more than 5,000 objects, including a solid gold coffin and a golden death mask. What did the tombs of the great pharaohs contain? What was buried with Thutmose III, the greatest military pharaoh in history? What was buried with Amenhotep III, the architect of the Golden Age? What was buried with Ramesses II, who reigned for 66 years? We will never know. The tombs of all these pharaohs were looted in antiquity, stripped of their treasures, their mummies unwrapped, stripped of their jewelry, and displaced to hidden caches by necropolis officials trying to salvage what the robbers had left. Their once magnificent burial chambers emptied of every single portable object of value, every gold fitting, every precious stone, every piece of jewelry, every amulet, every usable piece of linen and wood and metal. The wealth buried with the great pharaohs, wealth that must have dwarfed the already staggering contents of Tutankhamun's tomb, is gone, melted down, sold, lost. The golden mask of Tutankhamun, the most famous artifact in the world, may have been one of the least impressive death masks in the Valley of the Kings. The solid gold coffin may have been modest by the standards of the coffins buried with greater pharaohs. Everything we have from Tutankhamun may represent the minimum rather than the maximum of Egyptian funerary practice for an 18th dynasty pharaoh. The thought is sobering, and it should remind us that our picture of ancient Egypt, for all its richness, is based on the survival of a single, relatively modest burial, and on the fragments that the tomb robbers left behind everywhere else. And yet, for all the cautions about accident and arbitrariness, there is something genuinely and deeply moving about the tomb of Tutankhamun, something that transcends the ironies of fame and the contingencies of preservation, and that speaks to the most fundamental human experiences of grief, love, and the desire to protect those we care about from the finality of death. The more than 5,000 objects in the tomb were not placed there by an abstract civilization. They were placed there by specific human beings, by the priests and the officials, and the craftsmen who knew the boy king, who served him during his brief life, and who buried him with the care, the extravagance, the theological precision, and the material generosity that their faith demanded, their tradition prescribed, and their grief required. The dried flowers on the coffin, the cornflowers and the lotus blossoms and the olive leaves that had survived for 32 centuries, were picked by specific hands, arranged in specific patterns, and placed on the coffin by people who were saying goodbye to a boy they had known since he was 9 years old. The miniature coffins of the 2 stillborn daughters were prepared by people who understood the particular cruelty of losing children who were never born. People who believed, with a conviction so deep that it expressed itself in gold and linen and carefully mummified remains, that the unborn daughters deserved the same care, the same ritual, and the same hope of eternal life as the pharaoh who had fathered them. The tomb is, in this sense, not merely an archaeological site or a treasure trove or a media sensation. It is a memorial, a love letter from the living to the dead, a material expression of the human refusal to accept that death is the end, and that the people we love are gone forever. The belief may be wrong, the afterlife may not exist, the golden mask may serve no purpose beyond beauty, the model boats may never carry anyone across any celestial waters, but the love that put them there, the profound human love, the overwhelming grief, the stubborn, defiant, and magnificently irrational refusal to accept the cold finality of death, the grief that motivated the burial, the care that prepared the body, the faith that filled the 4 small rooms with 5,000 objects, is real. It is as real as the gold. It is as real as the bones. And it is, perhaps, the most important thing that the tomb of Tutankhamun has to tell us. Not about ancient Egypt, but about what it means to be human, to love, to grieve, and to refuse, with all the resources at one's command, to let the dead go gently into the darkness. It is late. The Valley of the Kings is dark. The limestone cliffs that frame the royal necropolis are black shapes against a sky dense with stars, and the entrance to KV-62 is a narrow opening in the rock, barely visible in the darkness, unremarkable among the dozens of other tomb entrances that pock the valley floor and the hillsides. So here is the answer to the question we have been building toward through this long night. Who was Tutankhamun, and why does his story matter? He was a boy, a sick, vulnerable, physically compromised boy, a disabled boy, a boy born into chaos and raised in the wreckage of a revolution he did not cause and could not fully understand. He was the son, the biological, genetically confirmed, DNA-verified son of the most radical, the most destructive, and the most theologically revolutionary religious innovator in the entire history of the ancient world. The child of a heretic pharaoh and the heretic's own sister, a product of incestuous union whose genetic legacy left him with a clubfoot, bone disease, and a body that required walking sticks to cross a room. He was placed, by the political calculations of men whose names we know and whose ambitions we can infer, on the throne of Egypt at the age of 9. Too young to govern independently, too young to make policy, too young to understand the Byzantine politics of the court, too young to comprehend the theological complexities of the Restoration, too young to make the decisions that would determine the future of the most powerful state in the ancient world, and too young to do anything but serve as the unwitting and largely passive figurehead for a restoration that was managed by older, wiser, and more politically experienced men who used the boy king's name and the boy king's authority to reverse the revolution that his father had launched and that his father's death had left unfinished. He ruled for approximately 10 years. He restored, or rather his politically experienced and theologically motivated advisors restored in his young name, the old gods. He reopened, or his advisors, acting with his royal authority, reopened the ancient temples. He issued the Restoration Stele. He changed his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun. He married his half-sister, Akhenaten, a young woman who was herself a daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, a child of the revolution who had been born in the heretic's city and who had watched the world her father built crumble and disappear. Together, they tried to produce an heir, a son who would continue the dynasty and secure the succession. They failed. The 2 pregnancies ended in stillbirth. The tiny bodies of the 2 daughters, carefully mummified and buried alongside their father in the tomb that Carter would discover 32 centuries later. He fathered 2 children, both daughters, both stillborn, both buried in miniature coffins in his tomb. And then he died, suddenly, unexpectedly, at approximately the age of 19, of causes that remain uncertain, leaving behind a kingdom that was still recovering from his father's revolution and a succession crisis that would be resolved by the very advisors who had governed in his name. The boy who could barely walk was buried with more than 130 walking sticks. The boy who probably never rode a chariot was buried with 6 disassembled chariots. The boy who probably never hunted was buried with bows and arrows and throw sticks and ceremonial daggers. The boy who ruled for 10 years was buried with the accumulated wealth of a civilization, with gold and lapis lazuli and carnelian and ebony and ivory, with food and wine and oil and incense, with linen and jewelry and amulets and figurines, with everything that the most powerful civilization in the ancient world believed a pharaoh would need in the afterlife. The burial was an act of faith, a declaration, made in gold and stone and painted wood, that the boy who had lived a brief, painful, physically constrained, and politically dependent life would live forever, would live in health, in strength, in freedom from the disabilities that had plagued him in the company of the gods, that the walking sticks would not be needed in the field of reeds, that the clubfoot would be healed, that the malaria would be cured, and that the boy who had been born into chaos would find, in death, the peace that life had never given him. The burial was also, in a sense that the men who performed it could not have known, an act of preservation, the sealing of a time capsule that would survive, through accident and geological fortune, for more than 3,000 years, until a water boy stumbled over a stone and an English archaeologist peered through a hole in a wall and saw, by the light of a single candle, the wonderful things that would make the most obscure pharaoh of the 18th dynasty the most famous ruler of the ancient world. The golden mask still stares forward, with those calm, dark, unblinking eyes, with that serene expression of divine certainty, with that faint, almost imperceptible smile that has been interpreted by a century of viewers as everything from royal composure to boyish vulnerability. The mask was made for a boy who died at 19. It has outlived him by more than 33 centuries. 33 centuries of silence, of darkness, of geological protection, and now of light, of cameras, of tourists, of scholarly analysis, and of global cultural fame. It will outlive us all, and it will continue to stare past the museum cases, past the tourists, past the cameras and the flashbulbs and the crowds, into an eternity that the boy who wore it believed was real, and that the mask, in its beauty and its permanence, makes it possible for a moment to believe might be. The tomb is quiet now. The silence is absolute, the silence of stone and sand, and the slow, patient, immeasurable passage of time. The 4 small rock-cut rooms that Carter and his dedicated team of archaeologists, conservators, photographers, and Egyptian workers spent a full decade painstakingly clearing are empty now, their contents removed, catalogued, conserved, and displayed in the museums where the modern world encounters the material legacy of the boy who was buried, with such care, with such extravagance, with such faith, and with such love, in this small, hastily prepared, geologically fortunate, and historically miraculous tomb more than 3,300 years ago. The objects are in museums, in Cairo in the new Grand Egyptian Museum at Giza, in the collections and the archives and the storage rooms, where the more than 5,000 artifacts that Carter and his team catalogued over a decade of painstaking work are studied, conserved, and displayed. The mummy is back in the tomb, returned to the small rock-cut chamber of K62 in the Valley of the Kings, resting in the outermost of the 3 coffins, covered by a climate-controlled glass case, alone in the dark of the burial chamber where the boy king was laid to rest more than 3,300 years ago. The curse is a story, the gold is real, the boy is dead, and the silence in the tomb is the profound silence of a civilization that believed, with a conviction so absolute, so comprehensive, and so materially extravagant that it filled 4 rooms with 5,000 objects for the burial of a single, physically disabled, historically unimportant teenager. That death was not the end, that the impenetrable darkness of the sealed tomb was not permanent, that the cold stone walls were not a prison but a chrysalis, and that the broken, disabled, malaria-ridden boy who lay within the golden coffin would rise again, would rise whole, would rise healed, would rise strong, would rise free of the clubfoot and the bone disease and the malaria and the walking sticks, would rise as a perfected, eternally youthful, and magnificently powerful God, that the boy would live again, that the mask would be his face in the afterlife, that the walking sticks, those 130 carefully preserved mobility aids that Carter found stacked and stored throughout the tomb, would help him walk freely and without pain through the eternal green fields of the paradisiacal afterlife, that the gold would shine forever. The gold does shine. It shines brilliantly, warmly, radiantly, with an intensity that 3,300 years of darkness could not diminish. It has shone for 33 centuries, through the darkness of the tomb, through the millennia of silence, through the drama of the discovery and the media frenzy of the curse, and the political controversies of the excavation, and the scientific investigations of the mummy, and the conservation crises of the artifacts. It shines in the darkness of the museums, and in the photographs, and in the memories of everyone who has ever stood before the mask and felt, for a moment, the weight of absolutely everything that was buried with the boy. Every object, every amulet, every dried flower, every miniature coffin, the weight of a civilization's faith, the weight of a father's revolution and a son's restoration, the weight of a body that was broken by genetics and disease, and the simple, merciless passage of time, and the weight of 33 silent, patient, geologically protected centuries of silence, and the weight of a golden face that has survived everything that time has thrown at it, and that will survive everything that time has yet to throw.